Go.
All right, let's go. Welcome. So this week's Torah portion is Tetze, and as we have been dealing with in the last few weeks, it comes from the book of Deuteronomy, and specifically these, if anybody is keeping track at home, this is starting from the 10th verse in the 21st chapter of Deuteronomy all the way through the 19th verse of the 25th chapter in Deuteronomy. Last week, our theme really was around law and order, maintaining a sense of justice, appointing judges as the way the Torah portion kicked off last week. This week, it's a very different topic. I would like to argue that the super duper broad theme is putting two things together, is really coupling things together, or maybe when two things should not be going together. And a little bit less abstract is really about men and women coupling together. So it's really about humans coupling themselves. That seems to be a lot more. Now, it's not everything in this week's Torah portion. It's not everything, but it's such an overarching, almost it's hard to ignore. It really is just super duper common throughout this week's Torah portion. So now that I've made this assertion, let me provide some examples of what we see in this week's Torah portion about men and women.
That'd be great.
Yeah, so the way this Torah portion kicks off, it starts with a man taking a captive woman in war, and then from there continues right on into what happens when a man has two wives, how should he accord the different children, and other things in this week's Torah portion include virginity claims and false virginity claims when someone gets married, rape and seduction, both with married people and unmarried people, a man not taking his father's wife, a man's exemption from military service if he is newly married, as well as a man marrying his deceased brother's wife if his brother did not have any children with her. And then that's a lot of stuff.
Yes.
That's a lot.
That
is a lot of stuff. But on top of all of that, what did you have? What?
A lot of it doesn't apply to today.
That's true. There's a lot that is certainly a lot less applicable to today. But there's one thing that I didn't mention, and which we're going to go into now, which is still actually quite and certainly very applicable to today, which is divorce. So now the particular, for what it's worth, the very particular circumstances that it actually comes up when it's actually the very beginning of the 24th chapter of Deuteronomy, verses 1 through 4. It actually is sort of mentioned in passing. It's not really dealt with fully head on, but really more of when someone's going to get a divorce, here's everything that should be done. And actually, the way it actually keeps going is that two people shouldn't get divorced, marry other people, and then get remarried after they've already divorced and like doubly divorced, and they shouldn't get back together again. But so in the meantime, I want to really focus on divorce, and I also think it's fascinating, and I think we'll deal with a little bit later about contemporary culture around divorce, because it doesn't sound as much of a taboo issue in the text that we will see. I think there's a sense of taboo, certainly in the latter half, I don't know, in America, I think in the 20th century that certainly existed. Okay, so as I usually do, let's check out these sources.
All right, it says, a man takes a wife and possesses her. She fails to please him because he finds something obnoxious about her, and he writes her a bill of divorcement, hands it to her, and sends her away from his house. She leaves his household and becomes the wife of another man. Then this latter wife of the wife of another man. Then this latter man rejects her, writes her a bill of divorcement, hands it to her, and sends her um, away from his house, or the man who married her last dies. Then the first husband who divorced her shall not take her to wife again, since she has been defiled, for the world is abhorrent to the Lord. You must not bring sin upon the land, and the Lord your God is giving you as heritage.
All right, thank you. So,
Well, now tell me this.
yes.
What do they mean? That's very negative against the woman. What do they mean by what's obnoxious about her?
Great. That is such a fantastic question. And you asked, I actually was going to circle this. So I'm actually going to circle right now obnoxious, because I don't know how common of a translation that is. That's not the, I will say, just reading the Hebrew, it's not even an obvious translation. So this is the expression here. And this is actually, actually, let me do all that. Here, something obnoxious about her. And then here is the Hebrew. Connected here. So it's unclear. Let me just say that, because, and it's really important to understand it's unclear, because it actually becomes, these two words becomes the topic of a debate in the early first century of the Common Era. Now, and I will just say it's unclear, because literally these two words, erva and davar literally means something, a thing, and then erva means, actually it has more of a licentious sort of connotation. There's something maybe sexually, I don't know, something off, which is why I find this particular translation, I'm sure, I wouldn't be surprised, Debbie, if you picked up 10 different translations of the book of Deuteronomy and you find 10 different translations for this word, okay? I'm actually surprised by the word obnoxious here. If I wanted to have a whole bunch of extra time on my hands, I would go around and really compile a whole bunch of other translations for this. That's a really fascinating thing here. Okay, so having mentioned that, let's just keep that in our minds. Whatever this ervat davar is, this guy finds an ervat davar in her, some sort of maybe sexually licentious thing. It's unclear. We will definitely return to that. So Debbie, that was a really fantastic question. Okay, so I will bring it up, because this also comes up in our parsha this week. It's in the 22nd chapter. This is another sort of opportunity sort of to uncouple. We're not going to read through all of it. I think people can find it if they're interested. It's in the 22nd chapter of Deuteronomy. It's in this week's Torah portion. But it's sort of virginity claims. So the basic idea of it is, what if a man he's getting married and he's supposed to be marrying a virgin, and it turns out she's not? That's a problem. But what if he makes this claim and it turns out she still really is actually a virgin? Then this is actually really fascinating. He's actually not allowed to divorce her. He needs to be stuck with her, right? She shall remain his wife.
Well, I don't understand something. How would he know she's a virgin or not a virgin?
I think the idea is that she would have hymenal blood, or basically he'll bust her hymen when they're their first.
Well, but a woman, a girl can have a hymen burst and still be a virgin.
Yes. Now, this is all, like I said, biblically. I can tell you, by the time of the rabbis 2,000 years ago, they were well aware of this. They were well aware of it. Just within this week's Torah portion, they're aware of it. Okay. I'm just going to insert that. But
So why then, if they're so aware of it, then why are they making such charges against the woman?
So I'm giving you, we're talking about two so totally separate things. The rabbis who came hundreds, if not thousands of years later, we can talk about them later. But for the really narrow confines of this week's Torah portion and the book of Deuteronomy, we'll just simply say that I'm really going to bracket the larger concerns of like, how do we know? I mean, that really could be definitely, if not one, it could, we could revisit this next year. But this could be certainly the topic of not only one, but maybe multiple different sessions on their virginity claims. But the virginity is prized, and I will simply say it's being contested, it's being questioned, but there's a value to it. But for our purposes of the divorce aspect, I do think it's fascinating, this possibility that after he brings this claim, but it turns out that he's wrong, that he has to be stuck with her. He's not allowed to divorce her. Okay, so we do see, like I mentioned, at the very top, people can divorce. And then we see here is an instance where divorce is an impossibility. It is a legal impossibility where someone brings up virginity claims against his wife and he is forbidden from divorcing her. Okay? And then we have a separate, again, also in our Torah portion, also in the book of Deuteronomy, and just like the previous thing, also in the 22nd chapter of Deuteronomy, that if basically if a man rapes a woman and she's a virgin, then he actually has to marry her, and he can also never divorce her. Now, I don't want to get into broader issues of rape. That's an entirely separate conversation. The reason I'm bringing this text up here for our conversational purposes is specifically this idea that, again, here is another case where someone is forbidden from divorcing, okay? He can never divorce. Lo yochal shachal kol yamav. He just can't, okay? This is clearly a problematic text for a lot of reasons. But I will.
Well, now let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
How do you know if a man is a virgin?
So I don't think anybody in the Bible, or I don't think anywhere in Jewish tradition anybody cares if men are virgins or not. I think maybe women like.
Well, if they're so focused on a woman,
I think it's more
why
about.
not a man too?
I think it's more about the penetrated aspect. Has a man ever been penetrated, or has a woman ever been penetrated? I think that's really I don't think people really care if a man has been penetrated himself or not, but they do care if a woman has been penetrated or not.
Well, why don't they care if a man isn't?
Why would anybody care about a man having been penetrated?
Isn't it supposed to be equal? A man, it's obvious with a woman, but what about a man?
What value?
I mean, reading that, you would assume that there is no concern about whether a man has had sexual activity or not.
I wouldn't even phrase it in the realm of sexual activity or not. I would be very specific to say that it is about having been penetrated or not. I don't think people are concerned about whether men have been penetrated or not, but they are concerned about the intactness of a woman having been penetrated or not. Does that help?
Well, if I understand about them being so concerned about a woman,
yeah.
But why are they not that concerned about a man?
Because I don't think women are really particularly concerned if men have been penetrated or not sexually.
Well, it seems like to me, being a simple person, there is more consequence for a woman. It's like a woman is subservient to a man.
So we could talk about
And I don't think God made it that.
So we could
I
talk
don't
about
feel like God
subservience.
made
I
it that
don't
way.
I don't think this is a matter of subservience. I think this is a matter of intactness, right? How intact a particular, how much, I don't know, for lack of a better term, sort of like structural integrity. But if I think the view here is if a woman has been penetrated, then to some degree she has been affected or otherwise acquired in some way, in some sort of sexual, emotional,
Okay.
sort of, and also quasi
Well, then,
social sort of acquisition too.
if in the first marriage it has been consummated and the man decides that he doesn't like her and gives her divorce papers,
Yeah.
then she marries a second man and she's been penetrated.
Yeah.
Well, then they can't marry.
So she can't remarry her first husband after they divorce. If there's another man that intercedes. But what this doesn't talk about is what if they get divorced, but then they want to come back together again. It doesn't discuss that. So maybe they could, but this seems to find it problematic if the first couple gets divorced, the woman then marries another man, maybe even another man, and then she wants to get back with her first husband. That is what is found to be problematic.
She can't do that.
She can't remarry her first husband after she marries a second or third or fourth.
Okay. Gotcha.
Okay, so I just mentioned these other two passages in Deuteronomy as talking about two people who can never get, two couplings who can never get divorced. I also want to bring up from the book of Leviticus people who can never marry divorcees. So in chapter 21, we see here a couple of excerpts. The first one is that Kohanim, and then also later on in the 21st chapter, that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, neither of them can marry divorced women. So basically, and that still is in effect till today, that Kohanim are not allowed to marry divorced women. So one difference, however,
Who is not allowed to marry divorced women?
Kohanim
Who did you
priests.
say?
Kohanim priests.
So a rabbi is not allowed to marry a divorced woman? Is that what you mean?
So not all Kohanim are rabbis, and not all rabbis are Kohanim.
What are Kohanim?
Great
What
question.
are they?
Great question.
What are they?
Great question. So let me see if I can find a good visual for this. Tribes of Israel. It's gotta be a really great one. Okay, images. Basically, there are 12 tribes. All right, this will have to do. All right, let's see. Screen share, stop share, screen share. Okay, so we have there are 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, and
Right.
it ended up being, so we were all into 12 different tribes. One of these tribes was actually the tribe of Levi. Now, what we don't see on this map is, what we don't see on this map is any land for Levi. Now, this was actually specified in the Torah because all the other tribes got land, but the tribe of Levi was not apportioned land because they were intended to serve the rest of the entire nation. Right, so they didn't get land because, and all basically there was like a little sort of tax or tithes that were meant to come to the Levites, to the tribe of Levi, for their service. Now, some of the particular families within the tribe of Levi, some particular clans, were actually designated as Kohanim. So in English, this gets translated as priests. And these priests, these Kohanim, they have even more specific particular duties and roles within the nation. And back when we had a temple, they had particular functions that they would serve in the temple, and the Levites would have other roles that they would serve in the temple and serving the Jewish people more broadly. So what we see, what I'm quoting here from the book of Leviticus, there are certain things that the Kohanim, that they have more restrictions placed on them and their activities and what they can do and what they cannot do. Okay, so these, so for instance, what we see here in the book of Leviticus 21, some of them, it's actually, we can look at it. Do you see this, Leviticus 22 here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so there are different things that they can and cannot do. It's, if you're really curious, you can read it. But the basic idea is that there's people that they're not allowed to come into contact with as far as corpses go, except for close family members. There are certain people that they can or cannot marry, as we see here, and there are other restrictions that they have concerning themselves. So does that help as far as who Kohanim are?
Did you explain? I didn't understand what the Kohanim are.
So the Kohanim, these priests, are a subset of families from within the Levi. Okay? And
From
all these things are
within
passed
the
down.
what?
These are passed down hereditarily.
Okay.
Okay? So most Jews nowadays come from the tribe of Judah, but there are some
Right.
from the tribe of Levi, and some of them are Levites, and some of them are Kohanim. Okay?
And the Kohanim is the priest group.
Yes.
They're from the priests.
Yes. So nowadays we basically have three categories. We have three hereditary groups of Jews. We have priests, we have Levites, and we have Yehudim, or just, Jews that we consider to be having descended from the tribe of Judah.
How do you figure out which one you're belonging to?
It's a tradition. Whatever your parents were, whatever their parents were, and going all the way back.
Well, we were from the Kohims. My husband was.
Oh yeah? Okay.
Uh-huh. So now, so there were three groups then?
So there are three groups. There used to be many more groups, but yeah, now there are just the main three groups: priests, Levites, and Jude, and like just regular Jews. And so we still have that. Now for chapter 21, we see that the priests are not allowed to marry divorcees, but Levites and Judites are.
Where do the Kohims fit into those three groups?
The Kohanim are the priests.
Okay. So that's the group that my family fits into then, right?
If you say so.
What difference does it make? What difference does it make whether what group you're in? Nowadays, there doesn't, does it?
I can go into this. This is also a whole other ball of wax. We can definitely go into this further in another conversation.
We could do that another time.
Right. Just as one example, is from right here, what I'm pointing out in Leviticus, which is that Kohanim are forbidden from marrying divorcees. That is one example, right?
Okay.
Okay, so that's one example of how it matters. There are other things within Jewish life. Aliyot to the Torah for Torah reading. Usually it goes, the first aliyah goes to a priest, the second goes to a Levite, and after that it's all non-Levites, non-priests. So that's one way in which we do see it play out in ritual observance today. Still, although we do have these, there are some other restrictions on what Kohanim can and cannot do. Still to this day. Okay, does that help? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So we do see here that there are people that cannot marry divorcees. Okay. Now, okay. So now, Debbie, you asked at the very beginning about this ervat davar, this thing. What does this mean? So back in the very beginning of the first century of the Common Era, so already 20 centuries ago, we see this text here, and it's a matter of dispute of how to understand this phrase of ervat davar. So it's really it's they were already debating it back then. So I'm just gonna read it out. So here are the two main schools at the time, the late second temple, the early first century. So we have one school of thought, Beit Shammai, Shammai's Academy, who says a man should not divorce his wife unless he has found her guilty of some unseemly conduct, or maybe some, I think even better, I think a better translation would be not just unseemly conduct, but somehow some sort of sexually inappropriate conduct, I think would be the more specific translation, and then uses the quote from this verse because he has found some unseemly thing in her. But I think there's a sexual connotation here. Beit Hillel says, even if she has merely burnt his dish. Now, this is really fascinating because these are two hugely different opinions. On the one hand, we have Beit Shammai says, no, you really should not be divorcing your wife. The only situation in which you should be divorcing her unless it's something of a sexual licentious matter, and that's a problem for the marriage. Beit Hillel says, no, it could be even something totally not sexual, even for the most quotidian of all things, even just burning a dish. Meaning, like, maybe food-wise, he's not happy culinarily in the relationship, and even for that can provide some sort of, at least he can find a textual basis for allowing that. So this is actually, Beit Hillel is very permissible for what sort of range of matters it could be for which one can divorce, whereas Beit Shammai is actually very limited. So I think it's a huge disparity. Now, and then of course we also have here Rabbi Akiva, who's sort of the turn of the going into the second century and early second century rabbi, who says even if he finds another woman more beautiful than she is, okay, that's a totally different thing. But the basic thing here is Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, the academies of Hillel and Shammai, one is very restrictive towards what he can divorce her for, and one is very permissive. Okay. So that having been said, do you have any questions at this point in time?
Mm-mm.
Okay.
No.
I want to go in a very different direction, which is at the same time that these two academies in the land of Israel were having this debate, this disagreement around this particular text, there was someone else, another Jew, although his opinions did not end up in Jewish canon, but yet his opinions very much we see still to this day, which was we actually see, okay, so in the New Testament, we see in the Gospels, Jesus, he actually takes this and goes in a very different direction. He's also working with the Hebrew Bible. He's also working with this as a very primary text. And yet he actually advocates actively against divorce. So I'm going to go in reverse. This is going to be the most backwards text thing ever. But text 7 from the chapter 5 in the book of Matthew. So he actually is quoting from the book of Deuteronomy. From our Torah portion, Jesus says, anyone who divorces their wife must give her a certificate of divorce, right? We see that in our Torah portion. But he says, I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorce. Okay. So it's interesting. He says, except for sexual immorality, which seems to go according to Beit Shammai's opinion, according to the house of Shammai, which is really fascinating. But text number 6, he fleshes it out more in the book of Deuteronomy, which is, it's interesting. Some Pharisees, who were basically the proto-rabbis, said, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Haven't you read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, again, from the book of Genesis, our Torah, and said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Again, book of Genesis. but they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So then they say, why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? In our Torah portion, in the book of Deuteronomy, so he says, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. Okay, anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Okay. If this is a situation, it's better not to marry. Okay. Again, these are decidedly Christian ideas. It's better not to marry because we still have this. But this is really fascinating. The assertion from Jesus saying, except for sexual immorality, meaning Jesus is basically agreeing with Beit Shammai, with the Shammai's Academy, saying, if there's a sexual immorality matter, that's okay, but you really shouldn't be divorcing for any other reason, which is really fascinating to see Jesus and Beit Shammai according versus Beit Hillel. And we basically see this through the Gospels, Mark chapter 10, same idea, that basically that when man and women were created in the book of Genesis and they come together as one flesh, that's it. And you really can't disconnect them. They're always really going to be connected, with the one exception of the woman doing something sexually inappropriate. It's super duper fascinating, and this again comes up in Luke in chapter 16, and then even after the Gospels, we see it in Romans and Corinthians. Okay, now it's super duper fascinating to see basically Jesus going like Beit Shammai against Beit Hillel, sort of in that second temple disagreement. What emerges though is two separate things. One is for, like I said, we're in America. America is not a Jewish country.
Right.
We are in, it's largely a Christian context, and divorce has been largely more understood more in Christian context, and those are the texts where that provide the foundation for Christian understandings around divorce, which is really, you shouldn't be getting divorced. You really just got to stick with one person. Man and woman were meant to be together, and once they come together, that's it. They're one flesh. With the lone exception mentioned in Mark and Matthew of unless there's sexual impropriety, and there they would agree with Beit Shammai. So that seems to be a similar expounding a similar understanding of that verse in this week's Torah portion. So I'm going to go back. So that having been mentioned, ultimately in our tradition we go overwhelmingly according to the opinions of Beit Hillel and not Beit Shammai, the Academy of Hillel. And so we actually have a much more expansive permissibility and notion of divorce, and it's not just for sexual licentiousness and transgressions. So what's interesting, we have in the Mishnah, which was published around the turn of the 3rd century, but includes older traditions, that the rabbis also, it wasn't just so much that they really followed in, the rabbis really developed the notion from Beit Hillel, the Academy of Hillel, that it wasn't just that you were allowed to, but actually there are certain cases where you really probably need to be divorcing, that there's almost an imperative to divorce. So here, Mishnah Ketubot 7:6, the following women are divorced and they don't receive their ketubah. We have some examples. But then we also have Ketubot 7:10, and these are the women that they force out to divorce. And there are certain cases about physical stuff. And anyways, it's just super fascinating that and then I'm not going to go into all the details in our tradition and literature about what the procedures are for divorcing and all the different details and who can divorce how, and that's not just a whole other ball of wax, like series.
What are the kinds of traditions of divorce?
There's a lot of them. There's a lot. I mean, really, we could do an entire.
Or just give me a generalization.
Well, here on the screen, Mishnah Ketubot 7:10 are certain people that they force women, I think, yeah, that women can, that they force the men, I'm sorry, they force a divorce where the men are involved, that the men have certain physical either defects or they're in certain lines of work, and they make the men get divorced because it's not fair to their wives that they have to be married to such men, which is
Okay.
which is an interesting situation, right? A leper, someone with an offensive nasal odor, all these different things that are, um, yeah, things that are just not fair.
What is the person, a person that is handicapped, a female that is handicapped, how is she handled in the faith as well?
That is a great question. I don't know off the top of my head, but I can look into that for you.
I'd just like to know.
Okay, I will look into that.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Now,
So,
where are we on this?
so we're basically towards the end of our conversation for today, but I want to point out that there's really, it's, they're really two separate things. I mean, the understanding of the terms that you asked about, right? That, I mean, I think really for anybody reading this week's Torah portion, what is this erbat davar, this sort of unseemly matter? What does it mean? How is it to be translated? And it was a matter of debate in the early first century and during the end of the Second Temple period. And on the one hand, we see, even within Jewish texts, we see these two huge academies clashing over how expansive or how restrictive this notion is. Is it like Beit Shammai, Shammai's academy, who says you can only get divorced, you're only permitted to divorce for a sexually licentious matter, whereas Hillel's academy says no, there's actually a wide range of license to get divorced. And fascinatingly, we see the foundation of Christian culture and Christian society going with an understanding that is really close to Shammai Academy's position, which is only for a sexual matter, but really, you really shouldn't be getting divorced for really anything else. And that also has really stayed with the Catholic Church for centuries, right? So we saw literally it was this particular textual issue. But for rabbinic literature, really that it went more with Hillel's academies, understanding that there's really a wide range of things. And not only just can you get divorced, but even in certain situations, they compel divorces. They force a divorce, such as when men are basically foul-smelling, or it's just not really fair for the women to still be married to them. So these are just some examples. Like I said, there's a whole range of literature. There's so much that can be read, studied, discussed, learned about the topic of divorce within our tradition. And it's a lot more, I don't know, where it's more of life. I mean, not everybody is meant, people get together, they marry, and not everybody is meant to stay married. And that's not really, and even though there might be some social stigmas around it, there's not, at least according to our tradition, there's not the same religious or sort of literary stigmas that attach. So I think these are important things to think about when it comes to discussing divorce and having an understanding of divorce in Judaism, which is to say that not everybody is meant for everybody when they get married. And, you know, you learn your lessons, you move on, and it's part of life.
Yep. You're right.
Yeah. So
well,
I think
now this Torah portion is basically dealing on divorce, correct?
Divorce pops up, but I would actually, I would argue the larger theme of this week's Torah portion is coupling, like men and women when they get together, but that it doesn't always just work easily. You know, all sorts of relationships work differently. Sometimes people need to divorce. Sometimes people stay together. There's just all sorts of, you know, permutations of it.
What is next week's portion?
It is Ki Tavo. It is Ki Tavo.
I enjoyed today. This was fun.
Wonderful. I'm happy
It
to hear
always
that.
is.
Awesome.
All right. You have a wonderful rest of the week. Bye-bye.
Okay, thank you too, Deb. All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.